Is Silksong actually too hard? No, I'd say not really. But also yes, and most likely not in the way it wants to be. There are some things to unravel here. Just 3 small side notes before we go further. 1. While I'll still be discussing the game in general, there will be no major spoilers in this video whatsoever. No bosses like game areas or special abilities mentioned or showed. After finishing a fully blind playthrough of Silksong myself, and after spending already 20 plus hours in the game on top of that, I honestly believe it to be one of the best gaming experiences of recent years. So obviously I would love nothing more than to preserve this same joy of first discovery for others. 2. I consider myself somewhat of an experienced player in the original Hollow Knight. Not in any way close to a level of speedrunner, let's be honest. But with over 70 hours of playtime and 112% completion achieved, I have a pretty solid grasp of its difficulty, mechanics and core principles. In combination with my professional background in game design, I believe such a viewpoint could be an interesting baseline for the discussion. And 3. From now on, to avoid any confusion, I will be using the name Hollow Knight exclusively to refer to the original game, and Silksong to refer to the recently released sequel. And that's it. Without any further ado, let's get back to the initial question. What's actually going on? After 7 long years, Silksong is finally released. It's amazing and incredible. And at the same time, some players almost hate it for being too difficult and for ruining the legacy of their beloved game. Even though it's not a majority in any form, with the opinions so polarized, there must be something worth looking at here. First of all, let's set the record straight. Original Hollow Knight is a difficult game. Not completely out there with I Wanna Be the Boshi and other much more obscure stuff, yes, of course. But it did present its players with some truly hard challenges and a lot of times didn't hold its punches. As the last expansion for the game was released in 2018, it's somewhat easy to forget that at the time the game was actually labeled as unwelcoming, unforgiving, brutal. So yeah, if a sequel to a hard game is also hard, what would be the origin of this new sentiment of Silksong is too much? My suggested reason number 1, 7 years is a lot of time and there's a chance some people actually just forgot. Hollow Knight had a peculiar difficulty curve. A bit counterintuitively, the more you played the game, the easier it became. Yes, there were new stronger bosses, more dangerous enemies, harder traversal, but on the main path, those were always matching your current tools and skills. That's the whole point of balancing a game. However, the locations from before, the ones that you kept visiting time after time due to the Metroidvania nature of the game, were only getting less and less perilous. And it's much harder to recollect the feeling of fighting for your life in those rooms for the first time, against the following 15 times you breeze through them in your high-level gear. It can understandably create the feeling that the old game was easier, even in some instances where it wasn't. Reason number 2, 7 years is a lot of time, and the anticipation for Silksong during that period reached full-on legendary status, for better or for worse. When the game finally arrived, much more people than just a bunch of veteran players jumped into it headfirst. And yeah, it is once again very unforgiving and is not that welcoming. Maybe even brutal. You know, not that common for a cute little game about bugs that you saw on TikTok to suddenly turn out to be a hardcore simulator of precise aerial bouncing while dodging humanoid ants' attempts to combo you into sashimi. How would you feel in such situation? Seems like an easy explanation. However, I would argue that there is something else here. Something much more deeply rooted within the game itself. Something that way too often gets unapologetically brushed off with one and only advice of "Get the..." Well, at times Silksong simply doesn't understand itself. Silksong is a spiritual sequel. An expanded version of the original Hollow Knight almost in every aspect. From the map size to the visual details density, from the amount of unique interactions to the variety of general systems. It seems obvious that bigger and better was the main philosophy during its creation. Therefore, it's not a surprise that its combo design was updated in exactly the same fashion. And it's definitely bigger, yes, but does this actually make it better? Before anything else, I honestly think Honest's fighting style is really cool. It's not as straightforward as classic Hollow Knight's fashion, and some people may find that not to their liking, that's okay. but it's undoubtedly a breath of fresh air and familiar packaging. Once you give it a chance, get somewhat acquainted, you probably won't have much trouble for the rest of the game. New movement and skillset are flashy, dynamic, and deserve to be praised in my opinion. However, combat is not only about the moves of the protagonist. It takes two to tango, and here comes a much more interesting topic to discuss. So, enemies. Hard fights were always a part of the core design of the Hollow Knight. Monsters with tricky attacks, excruciatingly tight arenas, multi-stage bosses with huge swings, double damage attacks always keeping you on your toes. Which of those does the Silksong inherit? Correct answer, every single one of them. When you make things bigger, you don't subtract. But now, how can you update them? If that is your goal as a developer, how do you make fights feel improved, especially for the players of the first game who have mastered hundreds upon hundreds of them by now? You add more enemy types, design more various tricky ways for them to hit you. You create more unique attack patterns, you give single creatures more variants of those. You design battles harder in general, and, well, you build enemies tankier and make their blows heavier. Oh, the elephant in the room. The already notorious Silksong double damage. A thing reserved for the bosses and some of the toughest enemies in the original, now a mundane detail almost right from the get-go. See your 5 masks at the beginning? Just divide those by 2 to make calculations and health management a bit easier, as almost every single location has a bunch of aggressive creatures eager to jump onto you and bonk you for that distinctive explosive sound. You will get blasted for 2 masks, combo slashed for 2 masks, touched for 2 masks, and even bitten and spitted to death for the same amount. Not gonna lie, 3 hours into the game, once I got a hang of these new rules, I unironically started bracing myself for the 3 mask attacks coming my way in the future. And I'm not gonna tell you if the game actually has those or not. With this sort of health crisis, or damage inflation, the mask upgrades as well for quite a while will feel somewhat disappointing. 5 masks or 6? Do those individual shards you collect even matter, if tons of fights will give you just 3 strikes before you're out nonetheless? Your health depletes rapidly, and unlike in Hollow Knight, recovers only in large chunks in exchange for your full meter. That means, most of the time you're basically forced to play riskier, hovering at 2 or 3 masks until the battle is over. And with early game double damage enemies, that often means, yeah, just 1 or 2 quick mistakes separate you from that fun and joyful run back for your money. The enemies themselves, on the opposite, will remain quite the punchbags for a long time. Some of the first enemies in the game will require 6 full blows to defeat, which is an absurd amount for a low-tier creature by Hollow Knight standards. Battles with them are longer, the chances of mistakes consequentially higher, and the encounters in general are just that riskier for the sake of it. But this is a type of difficulty that is somewhat easy to fix. You just tune health and damage numbers here and there up or down. Team Cherry already did exactly that with their hotfix patch, and announced there will be more similar fixes in the future, basically admitting to some balancing missteps in the released version. The other half of the difficulty equation of a Hollow Knight game, though, simply can't be adjusted as an afterthought. Platforming. How do you make sequels platforming bigger and better in comparison to the first game? Let's try to put ourselves in Team Cherry's shoes to maybe get some insight. To start things off, as obligated, you strip your protagonist of all movement abilities from 7 years ago and design new, stronger and flashier ones, which already could be a trickier task than expected. Every ability should be impactful, it should give you a sense of achievement once you acquire it, as well as it should be worth the challenge you overcome to get it in the first place. But at the same time, it can be too powerful, completely breaking the game, not only by itself but also in combination with the others. And as sad as it may sound, there are actually not that many original things you can come up with in a 2D platformer. So I wouldn't say that Team Cherry couldn't design more movement upgrades, but for one reason or another they decided to make the overall amount relatively compact, and this factor may have played some role. After you finalize your list of perks, here comes the hardest part. You spread this limited amount of unlockables throughout the game in such a way that players won't get them too quickly, and that is the moment when the problem of bigger and better resurfaces once again. Silksong world is gigantic, which combines really poorly with the finite amount of abilities. What do I mean by that? Imagine you have only 3 unlockables designed for your 8-hour game, with a classic double jump being one of them. What happens if a player gets it 40 minutes into the story? For over 90% of the game, this single fact will nullify all of the platforming challenges that don't require to use this ability to its fullest. Meaning you as a designer would be forced to raise the stakes in some other way down the line, if you want traversal to be a significant part of the experience, to avoid things getting stale, to give that also needed feeling of progression. Evidently, with aforementioned constraints, entire first half of the Silksong huge map turns out doesn't have that many unlockables, and it makes movement for quite a while feel restricted and slows down the overall progression. Though I won't be going into too many details on that here. Rather going back to the topic of difficulty. Next question would be, What do you do now to make platforming interesting and challenging all that time while a player has only some basic movement tools? Maybe you come up with environments that, in one way or another, substitute for the movement modifications. Yes, those red dots. The fact that I think I understand why they're here doesn't change that I cannot disagree more with their whole existence. I will say it as it is. Pogo hopping is really not a thing you must learn as a new player. Yes, it's powerful and stylish, especially with all the new graceful honors pirouettes, but it's a difficult mechanic that won't be a deal breaker in battles for a significant time. I completed the Path of Pain and I still didn't enjoy these blob trails with the new controls. I can only imagine how it feels for a completely new player. Or rather, I don't even need to with all the blob-induced raging videos on the internet. Why is bouncing a mandatory part of literally the third location in Silksong? And why does it get reskinned and repeated just one area later? It's precise, it's punishing, and it ramps up the difficulty really quickly, only to become fully skippable later on. With a grand map and tons of locations, obstacles like this, repeated time after time in different modifications, not only decrease the overall variety of platforming, but also creates hard skill checks that filter players, instead of giving them opportunities to gradually learn and improve. What is the point? Oh, and did I tell you that some surfaces now also deal double damage? Sometimes it feels like Silksong doesn't fully understand what it's trying to achieve at each particular moment. To create a completely fresh experience for new and old audiences alike, to give harder challenges to the veteran players, to perchance appeal to the speedrunners, in a way thanking them for the incredible impact that community had on turning Hollow Knight into the phenomenon we all know now. It's hard to say. The game is not easy. But this discussion would have never happened if the difficulty didn't tend to spike at the most unexpected points, severely punishing you for mistakes in places where it doesn't even matter. Strangely, it reaches its peak almost at the beginning and only goes down from there, creating rigid checks and barriers when you are still figuring out the controls, simply to retract the challenge once you are finally ready to face it confidently. Without spoilers, I would honestly say that some of the early game bosses to me felt more difficult than many of their late game counterparts, and much more frustrating for sure, because often their strength was achieved not through complex attack patterns and interesting situations, as those obviously would require you to simply have more ways to counteract, but rather through the sheer damage and health numbers, as well as the amount of stuff being thrown at once. You will be upgrading your health and damage, meticulously, steadily, and at some point those double damage enemies and frustrating bosses from the early game will become not an issue whatsoever. The traversal too will only become easier the more movement skills you unlock. Not once it will feel as unfair and brutal as it felt in the beginning. And that is the weirdest part. It's straight up an inversion of how a difficulty curve actually should look like. For some people, like me for example, all of this could be a minor inconvenience at worst. For others, a crucial thing breaking their immersion and sabotaging the playthrough right from the get-go. Does anybody win from that? I don't think so. And considering the patches and hotfixes, Team Cherry seems to agree with me. I can only hope that after some tweaks, Silksong could become that tiny bit friendlier to allow newcomers fully embrace its incredible world, full of secrets and mysteries. But until that moment, do all of the things I mentioned actually make Silksong bad? No, of course not. It is still an amazing, one-of-a-kind game. Team Cherry have once again created something truly special, something filled with love and care in every minute detail. It's a game of passion, an experience worth trying for everyone. It's beautiful, rich, and brings tens of hours of pure joy. But is there something to improve or for us to learn from? Perhaps.